Welcome to Mindecode Vault, the place where powerful ideas and life-changing mindset shifts unlock your true potential. If you enjoy short stories and insights that can transform the way you think, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the wisdom hidden inside each video. Stay with us because the next insight might be the one that changes everything. There is a moment, and if you've lived long enough, you know exactly the one I'm talking about, where you realize someone has been lying to you, not the dramatic movie-style revelation where a villain twirls a mustache and confesses everything. No, it's quieter than that. It's the slow, nauseating realization that the signals were always there. The way they paused a half-second too long before answering. The way their smile never quite reached their eyes. The way they always turned the subject back to themselves whenever you got too close to the truth. You saw it all. You just didn't know how to read it. That feeling, that specific cocktail of shame, anger, and regret, is what Patrick King built his book Read People Like a Book to address. King, a behavioral analyst and social dynamics coach, wrote this guide not for therapists or law enforcement officers, but for ordinary people navigating a world where almost everything of consequence, your career, your relationships, your financial well-being depends on your ability to accurately understand other people in real time. And what he found, after years of coaching and research, is both liberating and sobering. Most of us are operating nearly blind. We think we're good judges of character. Studies consistently show that human beings dramatically overestimate their ability to detect deception and read emotional states. We rely on gut feelings that are often just the echoes of our own biases and projections. We see what we want to see. We believe people who remind us of ourselves. We dismiss discomfort when trust feels too good to challenge. And in a world moving faster than ever, where strangers become business partners overnight, where someone's LinkedIn profile is a masterwork of personal branding, where the AI economy is already separating the perceptive from the oblivious, this blind spot is no longer just a social inconvenience. It is a survival disadvantage. This audiobook is not a summary. It is a transmission. What follows are 7 of the most unsettling, most useful, and most immediately applicable lessons distilled from King's work, delivered in a way that you can begin using before you finish listening. Whether you're a freelancer navigating clients, an entrepreneur reading investors, a partner trying to understand someone you love, or simply a human being trying not to get burned again, this is for you. The first lesson King builds his entire framework on is this: behavior is the only honest currency. Everything else, words, titles, credentials, charm, can be manufactured. Behavior accumulated over time and observed across different contexts cannot lie in the same way. A person can tell you they value loyalty, but watch what they do when loyalty costs them something. A colleague can claim to respect your time, but notice how often they're late, how often they reschedule, how often they expect you to absorb the inconvenience. The words are just advertisements. The behavior is the product. This distinction seems obvious until you realize how systematically we ignore it. King draws on research in behavioral psychology showing that humans are wired for narrative coherence. We want people's stories to make sense, and so we unconsciously filter out behaviors that don't fit the story we've already decided to believe. This is called the halo effect, and it's one of the most dangerous cognitive traps in human social life. Once someone has impressed us in one domain, they're physically attractive, or they seem confident, or they gave us a gift we didn't expect, we begin extending that goodwill to everything about them. We assume the attractive person is also honest. We assume the confident person also knows what they're talking about. We assume the generous person has no ulterior motive. The antidote King prescribes is what he calls behavioral auditing, the practice of deliberately separating what someone says from what someone does, and then looking for patterns over time rather than making judgments based on individual incidents. This is crucial. Single incidents are unreliable. A person can behave badly once out of stress, grief, exhaustion, or a bad day. A person can behave brilliantly once because they're performing, but patterns are truth. If someone is consistently late, that is not a scheduling problem. It is a values statement. If someone consistently takes credit for collaborative work, that is not forgetfulness. It is character. If someone is consistently generous when they need something from you and distant when they don't, that is not coincidence. That is strategy. Think about how transformative this is in a business context. Imagine you're a freelancer evaluating a potential client. They say all the right things in the discovery call. They're enthusiastic, they promise fast payments, they tell you they're easy to work with. But then you ask a specific question about their process, and they deflect. You ask about the last freelancer they worked with, and they pause just a moment too long before speaking. You notice that they've had 3 different people reach out on their behalf before this call even happened, suggesting a pattern of high turnover. These are behavioral signals, not accusations. Signals. King teaches that your job is not to prosecute people in your mind, but to gather data and let the data inform your decisions. The second lesson is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because it requires you to turn the lens on yourself before you can use it on others. King argues that your ability to read people accurately is directly proportional to your ability to read yourself honestly. And most people cannot do this. They cannot do it because self-awareness is not a natural state. It is a practiced discipline, and almost nobody practices it deliberately. Here's what this means in practice. Every time you read someone else, you are doing so through the filter of your own emotional history, your own unmet needs, your own patterns of relating. A person who grew up in a chaotic home may read calm, controlled people as cold and untrustworthy, because calm never meant safety in their experience. A person who has been burned by ambitious partners may read drive and ambition as a warning sign, even when it isn't. A person who learned that love equals sacrifice may read healthy boundaries as a rejection. These are not flaws. They are adaptations. But if you don't know your filters exist, you can't account for their distortion. King calls these emotional lenses, and he says that the first step in reading others accurately is cataloging your own. What kinds of people do you consistently misjudge upward or downward? What behaviors make you immediately defensive or immediately trusting? When someone feels too familiar too fast, is that warmth? Or is that a red flag you've been trained to ignore? In the modern professional world, this has urgent implications. Consider the rise of remote work and digital collaboration. You're no longer sharing physical space with the people you work with, which means you're losing the ambient behavioral data that in-person environments provide: the body language in the hallway, the tone of a casual conversation, the energy of a room. What you're left with is words, emails, Slack messages, video calls. In this environment, people who cannot read emotional subtext are genuinely disadvantaged. They miss the passive aggression hidden in a polite email. They miss the disengagement behind a smiling face on a Zoom call. They mistake brevity for professionalism and misread silence as agreement. King's recommendation is to develop what he calls a baseline of self. Spend a week doing nothing more than observing your own reactions to the people in your life, not judging the reactions, just noticing them. Who makes you feel anxious, and why? Who makes you feel immediately safe, and what is it about them that triggers that? Where do you tend to give benefit of the doubt, and where do you tend to assume the worst? This baseline is not therapy. It's calibration. You are calibrating your instrument yourself before you use it to measure others. The third lesson cuts to the heart of something most self-help books are too polite to say plainly. The way a person treats people they don't need tells everything about who they are. King introduces this principle early in the book, and it deserves to be said out loud as clearly as possible. The way someone treats a waiter, a customer service representative, a junior employee, a stranger, asking for directions, this is not incidental. It is diagnostic. We live in a world obsessed with how people present upward, how they treat their bosses, their investors, their social superiors, their clients, and people have become extraordinarily sophisticated at managing those relationships. But the human psyche leaks when there is no social consequence for unkindness, when the audience is someone perceived as lower status or irrelevant. That is when the authentic personality emerges. King cites studies on what social psychologists call prosocial behavior, the tendency to act generously and with care toward others. And he notes that people who are genuinely prosocial demonstrate it consistently, across status lines, not selectively when it benefits them. This insight has immediate practical value. Before entering a significant relationship, romantic, professional, financial, King encourages what he calls status-neutral observation. Put yourself in situations where you can watch the other person interact with people who have no power over them. Go to a restaurant with a potential business partner. Watch how they speak to the host when the table isn't ready. Watch how they respond if the order comes out wrong. Take a flight with someone you're considering for a long-term professional engagement. Watch how they treat flight attendants, how they behave when there's a delay, how they respond to inconvenience when no one important is watching. These moments are not tests you're administering. They're windows that open naturally if you're paying attention. And what you see through them is not the performance. It's the person. In the context of the emerging AI economy, where human skills are being scrutinized and revalued constantly, this lesson matters more than ever. As more tasks become automated, the premium on uniquely human qualities, empathy, integrity, collaborative spirit, is rising. Organizations and individuals who cannot identify genuine character traits in the people they partner with will consistently invest their trust, their time, and their money in the wrong people. The ability to cut through the performance and see the person is not just emotionally intelligent, it is economically strategic. The fourth lesson is where behavioral science gets genuinely fascinating, and where King earns his reputation as someone who synthesizes complex research into usable, street-level insight. The lesson is this: people communicate more through what they don't say and don't do than through what they do. Psychologists call this the study of omission, and it is one of the most underused tools in human perception. Consider the science of microexpressions, which King explores in detail. Microexpressions are involuntary facial movements that last only a fraction of a second, a flicker of contempt before a smile closes over it, a flash of fear before the voice steadies, a moment of disgust that vanishes before the professional mask resumes. These expressions are universal across cultures, documented by researcher Paul Ekman across decades of study, and they are nearly impossible to fake or suppress because they are generated by the limbic system, the emotional brain, before the prefrontal cortex has a chance to manage the presentation. What this means is that the truth lives in the moment before the performance begins. King doesn't ask you to become a microexpression specialist, because for most people that level of technical training isn't practical. What he does ask is that you pay attention to incongruence moments, when someone's words and their nonverbal signals are telling different stories. A person who says "I'm totally fine with that" while their jaw tightens and their eyes look away is not totally fine with that. A person who enthusiastically agrees while their body pulls back slightly is agreeing with their mouth only. A person who describes a situation as not a big deal, while their voice carries a frequency of tightly controlled emotion, is telling you it is a very big deal indeed. The skill here is not to play amateur psychologist and confront people with your observations. That is, as King explicitly warns, both socially disastrous and epistemically arrogant, because any single signal can have multiple explanations. Someone looking away doesn't necessarily mean they're lying. They may be recalling a genuine memory. Someone crossing their arms doesn't necessarily mean they're defensive. They may simply be cold. What you're looking for is clusters of incongruence, multiple signals pointing in the same direction, especially when they contradict the spoken content. This has a powerful application in high-stakes professional environments. Imagine you're in a negotiation. The other party says they're happy with the terms, but you notice their breathing has become slightly shallower. Their speech rhythm has changed just a little. They've started touching their face more frequently than they did at the start of the conversation. Individually, none of these signals means much. Together, as a cluster, they suggest something, not deception necessarily. It could be anxiety, which is worth knowing in itself. It means you may have more negotiating room than they're letting on. It means the conversation isn't as settled as their words suggest. Practice this by watching interviews. Political ones are particularly instructive with a sound off for the first few minutes. Train yourself to read the emotional subtext before you hear the verbal content. You'll begin to notice how rarely the two are perfectly aligned, and how much information lives in that gap. The fifth lesson is perhaps the most psychologically rich, and the one most people have never encountered. Framed this way, the personality traits you find most irritating in others are often the traits you most fear or suppress in yourself. King draws here on the Jungian concept of the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we've rejected, hidden, or denied, typically because they were discouraged or punished early in life. And one of the most reliable ways to identify your own shadow material, King argues, is to notice your strongest emotional reactions to other people. This is not comfortable territory, but it is extraordinarily useful. When someone's confidence triggers a disproportionate irritation in you, the question worth asking is, where in your life have you been told that your confidence is unwelcome? When someone's audacity makes you angry, the question is, where have you learned to suppress your own audacity? When someone's neediness makes you contemptuous, the question is, where have you learned to be ashamed of your own needs? These reactions are not character flaws. They are invitations to self-understanding. But the lesson doesn't stop there, because King is a pragmatist, not a therapist. He connects this insight to the practice of reading others. People project their own psychological material onto the people around them constantly. The person who accuses everyone of being manipulative is often themselves highly attuned to manipulation because they practice it. The person who constantly suspects infidelity may be managing their own temptations. The person who always assumes others have selfish motives may have difficulty acknowledging their own. Psychologists call this projection, and it is not a rare phenomenon confined to pathological personalities. It is a universal human process, operating at some level in all of us. For practical people reading, this means listen not just to what people say about others, but to what those characterizations reveal about themselves. A hiring manager who describes a previous star employee with thinly veiled contempt may be threatened by excellence. A client who describes their previous service provider as impossible to work with and does so with a detailed, almost pleasurable narration that suggests the grievance is still fresh and central may have been the more difficult part in that relationship. The pattern of how someone speaks about others, especially in negative contexts, is itself a psychological fingerprint. This insight becomes particularly powerful in the age of social media, where people perform their inner world publicly and constantly. The things people post about, the grievances they air, the kinds of content that make them angry enough to share it, this is projection on a massive scale. It is a continuous, public broadcast of what someone fears, covets, resents, and values. Learning to read it is learning to read the person in a way that most people, scrolling through their feeds, never think to do. The sixth lesson is the one that most directly serves your professional and financial life. Not all people are equal in their reliability, and the fastest way to identify the most reliable people in any room is to watch who takes ownership and who assigns blame. King calls this the locus of control test, rooted in a psychological framework developed by Julian Rotter in the 1950s, but as relevant now as it has ever been. People with an internal locus of control believe that their actions are the primary driver of their outcomes. They may acknowledge external circumstances, but they consistently return to the question, what could I have done differently? People with an external locus of control believe their outcomes are primarily determined by forces outside themselves, luck, other people, institutions, timing, the economy. They too may acknowledge their own role, but they consistently return to what was done to me. Neither orientation is entirely right or wrong. External circumstances are real. Luck is real. Systemic disadvantage is real. But as a signal of someone's reliability, trustworthiness, and capacity for growth. Locus of control is one of the most powerful predictors King identifies. People with strong internal loci of control tend to be more resilient, more accountable, more capable of learning from failure, and more trustworthy in professional relationships, because when things go wrong, they don't disappear into the comfortable story of victim. They stay in the problem until they can solve it. In the freelance and entrepreneurial economy, this distinction is existential. You cannot afford to partner with people who externalize their failures consistently. When a project goes wrong, we need people who will ask hard questions about what happened and what can be changed. When a client relationship deteriorates, you need people who can acknowledge their role in it. When a product fails, you need people who resist the temptation to blame the market and instead go back to the drawing board. One of the fastest ways to audit someone's locus of control is to ask them about a significant failure in their professional life, and then listen not just to what they say, but to the grammatical structure of their story. How many sentences start with I versus they? How much of the narrative is about what was done to them versus what they did? How does the story end with insight and change, or with vindication? King also points out that locus of control can shift situationally. A person who generally takes ownership may externalize blame in specific domains that feel too painful to examine. A brilliant entrepreneur might have an internal locus of control at work and a completely external one in their intimate relationships, never recognizing their role in their romantic failures. These domain-specific externalization patterns are worth noting, because they map the blind spots, the areas where someone cannot learn, cannot grow, and cannot be relied upon to self-correct. The seventh and final lesson is the one that ties everything together, and it is the one that most people resist the hardest, because it feels ungenerous, and because we've been culturally conditioned to believe that optimism about human nature is virtue and skepticism is cynicism. But King says plainly, and with compassion, trust must be earned through evidence, not extended as a default. And the people who are most skilled at manipulating others depend absolutely on your willingness to extend trust before it's been earned. This is not an argument for suspicion. It is an argument for patience. The difference is profound. Suspicion assumes the worst and looks for confirmation. Patience withholds judgment and waits for evidence. Suspicion is emotionally exhausting and relationally toxic. Patience is strategic, and it actually allows for genuine connection, because when trust is earned, it is real. When it is assumed, it is a gamble. King introduces what he calls the investment test, a deliberately small, low-stakes ask that tells you something significant about how someone handles accountability. In a professional relationship, this might be, do they do what they said they would do on the timeline they said they would do it without needing to be reminded? In a personal relationship, it might be, do they remember details you've shared with them, and do they act on that knowledge in small ways that show they were actually listening? In a social context, it might be, do they follow through on casual commitments, the plans they said they'd make, the introductions they offered, or do those offers evaporate with a social moment? These tests are not manipulative. They are observational. You are not engineering failure. You are watching how someone naturally operates. And what you find from them, over time, is a picture of someone's integrity at the granular level, with a level where most people never look, because they're too distracted by the grand gestures and the impressive presentations. The modern information environment makes this lesson more urgent with every passing year. We live in an age of personal branding so sophisticated that distinguishing authentic from performed has become a professional skill. The influencer economy, the LinkedIn personal brand movement, the TED Talk culture of polished storytelling, all of these have raised the production value of human performance to an extraordinary level. Anyone with access to the right tools and enough social intelligence can construct a compelling persona. What cannot be constructed is consistent behavior over time in low-stakes, unobserved moments. That is where the real person lives, and that is where your attention should go. Here is what all 7 lessons have in common, and here is what King is really saying beneath all the psychology and the behavioral science. Most human suffering That comes from other people, comes not from malicious people targeting us, but from our own unwillingness to see clearly. We wanted to believe someone was different. We ignored the signals because changing our minds felt like failure. We extended trust before it was earned because withholding it felt unkind. We told ourselves a story we preferred over the story the evidence was telling. Seeing people clearly is not a betrayal of warmth. It is not the opposite of love or generosity or hope. In fact, it is the only foundation on which those things can be real. You cannot genuinely love a fantasy. You cannot genuinely connect with a performance. You cannot genuinely trust a stranger with your future based on a first impression, no matter how dazzling. Real warmth, real trust, real intimacy, these things require that you see the other person truthfully, including the parts that are difficult, including the gaps between their words and their actions, including the slow behavioral evidence that accumulates before you're ready to acknowledge what it means. The cost of not developing this skill is not abstract. It is measured in the relationships you stayed in too long because you couldn't see the pattern. It is measured in the business partnerships that went sideways because you trusted a presentation instead of a track record. It is measured in the opportunities you missed because you couldn't distinguish authentic mentorship from performance. It is measured in the years, sometimes decades, people spend recovering from the consequences of misjudging character at a critical moment. And here is the thing that King understands, and that this audiobook wants to leave you with. You are not bad at reading people because you're naive or weak. You are bad at reading people because nobody ever taught you how. The skills are learnable. The patterns are recognizable. The signals are already there, in every conversation you've ever had, in every room you've ever walked into, in every relationship you've ever navigated. They've always been there. You just needed the language to see them. Start today. Start small. Pick one person in your life and spend 1 week doing nothing more than noticing the gap between what they say and what they do. Don't confront. Don't judge. Just observe. Write nothing down if you don't want to. Simply pay attention with the specific, patient, non-reactive attention that King describes throughout this book. You will be surprised, possibly unsettled, by what you begin to see. But you will not be blind anymore, and that changes everything.